Religion and science. Friends, almost every day, usually several times a day, I'm dealing with this problem of religion and science. It blocks so many people, I find, in approaching or accepting the faith. What's the problem? Well, in a word, it's what I call scientism. What's scientism? It's not science. I love science. Affirm it. Scientism, though, is the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. And now, if you had told me this 10 years ago, I'd never believe you. But it is rampant in our society, especially in young people, because I hear it all the time. The reduction of knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. Now, what's scientific form? Observe, empirical observation, form a hypothesis, test it through experimentation, draw conclusions. Good method? Yep, it's a great method. Effective? You bet, within its proper framework. The attendant technologies it's given rise to? Wonderful? Yes. And that's why I think, it's one reason why, scientism begins to take hold. Because people have seen the huge success of the sciences, and they say that's the way to know things. Now, what's the upshot of that in regard to religion? Religion ain't science. Therefore, it's what? Nonsense. How often I hear this, it comes right out of Christopher Hitchens. Bronze Age mythology, old superstition, pre-scientific nonsense. And the disciples of Hitchens are everywhere out there. Scientism relegates religion just to the kind of ash heap of intellectual history. What do we do now with scientism? How do we respond to it? Here's the first way. Scientism is itself logically incoherent. How come? Where did you empirically observe or experimentally verify that all truth is simply scientific? Where'd you see that? Where'd you experiment with that? How'd you draw that as an empirical conclusion? The answer, of course, is you didn't. Scientism is itself a metaphysical or philosophical position. And therefore, the advocate of scientism is lost in a deep incoherence. See, and that little move does something great. It opens you up now. That in fact, you are always already engaged in other ways of knowing beyond the scientific. Another way I've teased people who are caught in scientism, do you think Homer knew anything worth knowing? Think Aristotle knew anything worth knowing? How about Plato? How about Cicero? How about Augustine or Thomas Aquinas? Martin Luther? How about Immanuel Kant? How about Hegel? How about the Niebuhr brothers? Think those people knew anything worth knowing? None of them engaged in what we call science. Art, philosophy, poetry, literature. Do they yield up to us any truth? See, of course, anyone I think who's intellectually honest would say, of course they do. And yet they are not scientific forms of knowing. I've teased people often on this score because I found that they don't know philosophy well. They don't know poetry well. And see, religion is a close cousin of philosophy and poetry and literature. Here's one of the problems, too, with scientism. So many people believe the great modern myth of origins. By which I mean modernity, science emerged out of a long twilight struggle with religion. That sound familiar? I hear it every day. How did the sciences emerge? Well, out of this terrible struggle against the obscurantism of religion. Back in those dark ages, right? By the way, which gave us Chartres Cathedral and Dante and Thomas Aquinas. It wasn't so dark, believe me. But out of this terrible dark ages, there emerged, with a terrible struggle, there emerged the sciences. Who's the patron saint of this story? Galileo, whom I hear about, again, practically every day on these forums. Oh, how the church persecuted poor Galileo. imprisoning this pioneer of modern science. And that becomes the paradigm in many people's minds for the relationship between religion and science. So it's always gone. Well, can I suggest to you, friends, that that is a complete myth. And the fact that it seized the minds of so many of our younger people is really sad and tragic. I would argue, on the contrary, that the sciences in the West emerged when and where they did, not so much against religion, but precisely because of religion. One thing I'll say to people is, where do you think of Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and Newton and company learned their mathematics, their astronomy, their physics? They learned them, of course, in church-sponsored universities. More to it. What's required intellectually now for the emergence of the sciences? Two great assumptions, at least, both of which are theological in form. For the sciences to get off the ground, scientists have to believe that the world is not God and that the world is intelligible. Think about it for a second. If you think the world is divine, and a lot of people do, from ancient times through many forms of animism, go right up to Star Wars, right? May the force be with you. What's the force but the zoom of energy that runs through and unites all things? Well, that's a kind of nature mysticism. If the world is divine, what don't you do? Well, you don't analyze it, experiment on it, objectify it. No, you honor it, you worship it. The sciences, the experimental sciences, the empirical sciences emerged because people assumed the world wasn't God. But secondly, for any science to get off the ground, the scientist has to believe, and I use that word on purpose, has to believe the world is intelligible. Now, I'm not defending any kind of intelligent design point of view here. Something more basic. That the world is endowed with some intelligible structure. Think now of any science. Biology assumes what? That life has a logos to it. Psychology assumes the psyche has a logos to it, a reason, an order. Astronomy assumes the stars have a nomos to them, right? A law, an intelligibility. Any scientist in any field has to assume the world that she goes out to meet is a world endowed with intelligible structure. Now I ask you, where do those two ideas come from? That the world is not God and the world is endowed universally with intelligible structure. It comes from the belief in creation, in a creator God. If God has made everything, then we know that the world isn't God, it's other than God. But if God has made everything, then everything is stamped with some sign of God's great intelligence. Creation is the theological assumption behind the emergence of the sciences. See, once you see that, you see this very deep compatibility between religion and science. They're not mortal enemies, but one is the condition for the possibility of the other. Now see, revisit some of the great Christian texts. In the beginning was the Word. How important that is. The Word, God's mind. And of course the Greek term there is logos, logic, pattern, harmony, order. In the beginning was the divine mind. And all things came to be through that mind. That's the foundation for science. Without that, the scientists have to fold up. If you don't assume intelligibility, you will not go out to meet the world with your inquisitive intelligence. Something else now about the sciences. The Galileo case, I argue, with all its complexity, and it is complex, it's not an easy black and white sort of case. But the Galileo case, I would argue, is one paragraph on one page in one chapter of a very long book. To isolate that one paragraph and say that tells the whole story of religion and science is simply a distortion. Look, for example, at the great founders of the sciences. I mentioned, Galileo himself, but Tycho Brahe, Pascal, Descartes, Newton. Devoutly religious people who saw no conflict between their religion and their science. In fact, tried to show links all the time. Gregor Mendel, 19th century figure, Augustinian friar, absolutely central to the development of genetics. Come up into the 20th century now. One I love to tell, because most Catholics don't know about this. The formulator of the Big Bang Theory, Georges Lemaitre, was a priest. In fact, I did a little YouTube video on this, and it got a giant reaction from a lot of Catholics. I had pictures of Georges Lemaitre in his big Roman collar next to Einstein. Because Georges Lemaitre had to convince Einstein of the rectitude of the Big Bang Theory. Einstein didn't buy it, and Georges Lemaitre convinced him. My point is, don't isolate Galileo as the story that tells the whole story. The whole story is far more interesting, far more compelling. Just a last observation. When I was filming for the Catholicism series, I wanted to make this point as vividly as I could. So I went to a mountaintop outside of Tucson, because on top of that mountain is an observatory with one of the highest level telescopes in the world. The observatory is run by the Vatican. The Vatican Observatory, one headquarters is in Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer home, but the other one is in Tucson, on this mountain, where one of the best telescopes in the world is found. Science and religion, at bottom, are great friends and allies.